When we think of the great explorers, we typically remember them for achieving their goals, right? But today I'm going to tell you the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and his trip to Antarctica. Now, his goal was to lead the first group to cross Antarctica on foot. However, he never reached this goal. In fact, everything went terribly wrong. So why do we remember Shackleton? Because of the great leadership he showed during the trip. Shackleton left England in 1914 on the ship the Endurance. He had a crew of 28 men, including the ship's officers and sailors, and some scientists who came along to do research. In January 1915, they entered the Antarctic Circle. However, it was colder than normal, and the ocean was full of ice. And the Endurance soon became stuck. Shackleton and his crew realized they'd have to wait 10 months until November, which is springtime in the Antarctic Circle, for the ice to melt. So, there they lived, on the ship, stuck in the ice and waiting for spring. Now, Shackleton, who was called the boss by his men, kept their morale up by keeping them busy. Now, in those days, ship's officers and scientists didn't usually interact with sailors. The officers and scientists usually got better food and lived in better conditions. But Shackleton needed everyone to work as a team and not as individuals. So, everyone shared the jobs on the ship. The officers and scientists labored right beside the sailors, cleaning the floors, and the sailors helped with the science experiments. Everyone ate the same food together at the same table. And consequently, the men all became friends and learned to work together. Over the long winter, as the ship floated with the ice began to crush the ship. The crew could hear the awful sound of the wood bending and breaking as the ice closed in. And so in October of 1915, Shackleton ordered everyone to move off the ship and onto the ice. For nearly a month, they lived on the ice, next to the dying ship, watching it get slowly crushed. Then on November 21st, 1915, with Shackleton's cry of, "She's going, boys!" the men watched, horrified, as the Endurance came apart and sank into the water. But even when everything seemed hopeless, Shackleton didn't give up. He promised his men that if they worked hard and stayed together, they would get home. Now, at this point, Shackleton's leadership style was very important to the survival of the crew. Because of the way he treated the men, treating each man with respect, the crew became extremely loyal. They believed in him. If Shackleton believed they would get home, well, the men believed it too. With the arrival of summer in March of 1916, the ice they had been living on began to melt. At this point, Shackleton and his men knew that they had to get to land. Now, they had floated close enough to see Elephant Island, a small rocky island about 100 miles off in the distance. So in April, Shackleton and the crew got into 3 small boats they had saved from the ship. And after 7 days of rough water and freezing temperatures, they finally made it to Elephant Island. It had been 467 days, more than a year since the men had stood on land. However, they still had absolutely no hope of rescue. No one knew where they were. At this point, Shackleton made his riskiest decision yet. He decided to take one of their small boats and sail back to a whaling station on South Georgia, an island about 800 miles away, and get help. He left Elephant Island with 5 men, promising to return and rescue the others. After 17 days of sailing through some of the roughest waters in the world, Shackleton and the 5 men finally made it to South Georgia, amazingly. However, they still had to walk for 36 hours over ice-covered mountains to reach the whaling station, so their job wasn't done. And when they walked inside, as the story goes, the station manager took one look at these guys and said, "Who are you?" It had been so long that everyone thought Shackleton and his crew were dead. Over the next 4 months, Shackleton tried 3 times to rescue the men back on Elephant Island. But the sea was still full of ice, and the ships couldn't make it. Meanwhile, the men on Elephant Island were surviving, but had started to lose hope. They began to think that Shackleton had never made it to South Georgia, and that they'd be stuck in Antarctica forever. Then on August 30th, 1916, nearly 2 years after their trip had begun, the men saw a ship approaching in the distance. They ran to the beach, waving and shouting. It was Shackleton, coming to rescue them. Shackleton, from the ship, counted the men on shore and cried with happiness when he saw that they had all survived. He'd kept his promise to them. For this, Shackleton is credited as one of the great heroes of the time. Not for reaching his original goal, but for leading his men through some of the worst conditions in the world and keeping his promise to them to bring them home alive.